President Yoon Suk Yeol is poised to depart for France next week to attend the General Assembly of the International Bureau of Expositions and to meet with his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron in Paris before heading to Vietnam with an impressive group of Korea's corporate leaders. So why is the president attending the General Assembly of the BIE? Where do Korea's overall ties with France stand? And what are the prospects of greater economic collaboration between South Korea and Vietnam? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we provide you with a preview of the upcoming presidential agenda in France and over in Vietnam as President Yoon Suk Yeol prepares to embark overseas. For more, I have Professor Lim Eun-jung at Kongju National University joining us live on the line. Professor Im, it's great to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Kwon Soa with us, so it's good to have you here.
My pleasure, as always.
Right, so let's begin with President Yoon's agenda in France. I believe the purpose of his trip is to promote Busan's prospects of hosting the 2030 World Expo. Tell us more.
Right, President Yoon Suk Yeol is set to depart on his next overseas trip on Monday the 19th, and with his first stop being France. So he will take part in the General Assembly of the BIE, or the Bureau International des Expositions, from the 20th to 21st in Paris to garner international support for the 2030 Busan World Expo. The fourth presentation will be held there for the Expo bid, which will be at the 172nd BIE General Assembly. At the next assembly in November, the 2030 World Expo host will be selected. So this one is also going to be a very important task. Now, the BIE is in charge of assessing the feasibility and viability of each candidate city, which, apart from South Korea's second most populous city, Busan, are Riyadh of Saudi Arabia, Rome of Italy, and Odessa of Ukraine. President Yoon on Tuesday will attend the Expo presentations in person, and on Wednesday he will be at an official World Expo reception hosted by Korea to drum up support for South Korea's bid from international delegations there. Also on that day, President Yoon is slated to hold a bilateral summit with his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron at Élysée Palace. Presidents Yoon and Macron are expected to discuss ways to develop their respective Indo-Pacific strategies and contribute to freedom, peace, and prosperity, according to Kim Tae-hyo, Principal Deputy National Security Advisor, in a press briefing earlier this week on President Yoon's overseas trip. And also, as South Korea has recently been chosen as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council from 2024 to 2025, the meeting is also anticipated to bring up discussions on cooperation on security issues. France, of course, is one of the 5 permanent members of the UNSC. Now, previously, Presidents Yoon and Macron had met on the sidelines of the 2022 Madrid summit of member and partner countries of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And when Yoon concludes his meeting with Macron next week, he will have met with all G7 members and leaders of the European Union in the past 2 months. So lots of diplomacy that had happened recently. Also, during his stay in France, President Yoon and First Lady Kim Gun-hee are scheduled to get together with ethnic Korean residents of France, have talks with young people on innovation, and also are going to attend a Digital Vision Forum and an investment declaration ceremony with European countries.
Right, a very busy schedule ahead then. And against that backdrop, Professor Im, what can you share with us about Korea's, South Korea's, that is, diplomatic ties with France?
Sure. The France is actually one of the oldest international relations with South Korea. Again, the Korea back then, more than like 100 years ago in the 19th century, 1886, and Korea got the commercial treaty with the France. But of course, later on, the whole Korean peninsula was under the Japanese empire's the colonial rule. But later, after the liberation, again, the France very early, I mean, they recognized the Republic of Korea, South Korea, officially, which was pretty early because France was the second one in Europe, just next to the United Kingdom. So, having said all this kind of, historical facts, you might have thought about those historical ties between Korea, today's Korea, and France is pretty much deep and old. And of course, France, they contributed to the Korean War as well. They dispatched their troops, as a part of the UN troops. So they, in that sense, of course, they contributed too. But after that, again, we built up the diplomatic ties with France. The bilateral relation has been growing substantially in many different areas, not only just economically, of course, culturally. Another interesting thing is, the Korea's express, the high-speed railroad, which is called the KTX. We adopted the actually French technology, DZBZ technology. That's another probably interesting example. The fact again that reveals the pretty deep intertwined ties again with the France. So having had all this kind of interesting historical relationship with the France, as you just mentioned, again South Korea, we just got the non-permanent seat in the UN Security Council, and as we all know, the France is one of the permanent 5. So I expect more talks, dialogues, communication with France, which is again the permanent member of the UN Security Council, for further cooperation.
Right, and before I ask you more about that, Professor Lim Soa, first, could you tell us a bit about the economic ties between Seoul and Paris?
Sure. Now, despite the COVID-19 pandemic and also South Korea's export figures really not looking as good as in past years, actually the trade between South Korea and France has been growing fairly well. In fact, last year, bilateral trade volume reached a record high of $13 billion. The 10th and 7th world economies, Korea being the 10th, have been strong economic partners since the 1960s. A presidential office stressed that France is one of Seoul's key European partners that has closely worked with Korea during all major processes of Korea's economic development during a briefing on President Yoon's trip next week. So enough reason for why there is expected to be a great amount of focus on securing jobs for future generations and discussion on the expansion of investments in a variety of fields like space, AI, and future industries. And some of that was already discussed last year at the end of June when President Yoon Suk Yeol and his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron got together in Madrid, Spain for the NATO summit and had a chance to discuss bilateral ties. Presidents Yoon and Macron assessed that Seoul-Paris cooperation has been extended on universal values such as liberal democracy and human rights, agreeing to bolster strategic cooperation in various areas. One of the areas they touched upon was the nuclear power sector. The two leaders saw eye to eye on the importance of nuclear energy, especially to achieve carbon neutrality. And with that, they vowed to strengthen bilateral cooperation in nuclear power generation, keeping nuclear power plants safe, as well as enhancing competitiveness in the nuclear industry. Another sector the two shared views on and expressed hopes for stronger cooperation on was the space sector. Discussions included working together on the development of small and medium-sized satellites. Issues on the Korean peninsula were also brought up, with President Yoon calling for France's support in achieving complete denuclearization on the Korean peninsula, especially, again, with France being a permanent member of the UNSC, which deals with North Korea's provocations, and to which the French leader praised the South Korean government's efforts, especially diplomatic efforts in regards to that matter. It was also the NATO sideline summit where President Yoon asked for support from France on South Korea's bid to host the 2030 World Expo in Busan, and President Yoon on that occasion also invited his French counterpart to South Korea.
Right. And now, Professor Im, as you mentioned, South Korea has secured a 2-year rotating seat at the UN Security Council starting next year. And France, as Soa also mentioned right now, France, it is a permanent member of that council. That being said, Professor Im, and you mentioned it earlier, tell us a bit more about the potential collaboration between these two countries against regional and, of course, global security concerns.
Sure. Well, absolutely, number one top priority for South Korea cannot but be the North Korea's nuclear issue. Of course, we have tried many different approaches. Again, for example, in 1994, agreed framework, Geneva agreed framework. It was more like a kind of bilateral between the North and the United States, which back then, again, which was a big, actually, result, again, the kind of success. But of course, even that kind of bilateral framework couldn't stop all this, nuclear ambition. But later, we tried another like a multilateral approach, which is called six-party talks. Again, China took the initiative and took the leadership, and China's that kind of leading, coordinating, facilitating role was pretty good thing too. But again, ultimately this couldn't stop again the nuclear ambition of North Korea either. But what I'm trying, and we of course, experienced another like a series of summits between North and South and between North and the United States during the Moon Jae-in administration, that period. But what I'm trying to say is we have tried many different approaches, formats to fix this problem, but consequently speaking, which is very unfortunate, none of this actually didn't really work. So having said that, now these days, again, the U.S.-China strategic rivalry is pretty intense, and especially since the war caused by, of course, invasion by the Russia to Ukraine. Especially since that moment, again, this confrontation between the Russia and the West is pretty severe these days. And having had all this kind of confrontations across the regions, of course, solving the North Korea's nuclear problem is definitely, of course, huge challenge, but we need a more like a creative, I think, a format or approach to deal with this problem. In that sense, I personally do think European countries' role can be bigger than before. And having said that, again, France is again one of the P5 members. They definitely do have leverage over other countries, other P5 members or other European countries as well. So I think France can do more even in dealing with the North Korea's nuclear issue. And nuclear for civilian purpose, as just, Ms. Kwon just explained very well. Again, France is one of the top nuclear power countries in the world, and Korea is also. So for those, civilian purpose, for carbon neutrality, climate change, all the things can be another like a very good common agenda between South Korea and France. Or human rights, all this freedom, human security issue, those things also can be very good agenda for the two countries' cooperations, because basically we share our value with the France as, again, the liberal democracy and as republic, and the countries who do love, of course, respect the human freedom. So I think, again, that there can be more and more potentials, again, between the two, even in the Security Council, that arena.
Right, of course. Meanwhile, so with regard to Busan's bid for the 2030 World Expo, what have been some of the projected economic gains for South Korea in the case of Busan hosting that particular event?
Well, from a tourism boom to a massive amount of new jobs and development of infrastructure, there are boundless possibilities for the 2030 Busan Expo to reap economic benefits. Now, speaking in money terms, according to the Korea Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade, over 61 trillion won, or some $46.4 billion are estimated to be generated from hosting the 2030 Busan Expo. To put that into perspective, it's twice the amount gained during the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics and 4 times the amount generated during the 2022 World Cup. This as that should be the 2002 World Cup. And this as 50.5 million people from 200 countries are predicted to visit Busan during the 6-month event. Over 500,000 new jobs are expected to be created if Busan does become the host of the 2030 World Expo. A new airport, hydrogen transportation, a floating island, and a flying taxi are some of the envisioned plans, as well as an exhibition space filled with future technologies like 6G network, augmented reality, and more, which means new workforce is needed for all of these new projects. Also, the significance of the economic gains are that currently South Korea's economy is focused in and around the capital Seoul. That's why there have been calls for new pillars for economic development in order to resolve regional disparity. So Busan and other nearby cities in the southern regions could become such new pillars.
Right, flying taxis is something I'm also looking forward to. So,
Same here.
Right, Professor Im, what look to be the possible diplomatic merits of hosting the 2030 World Expo for South Korea, of course?
Well, Seoul is a well-known global city these days, but Busan is another hugely, tremendously attractive city, I think, because, this is not new city. Of course, Korea does have a long, 1,000 years long history, and Busan is another older city, which is, of course, the number 2. But especially during the Korean War, again, those people who seeking for the safety, they moved to the Busan, and Busan became really pretty much diverse and a dynamic city. And this is, of course, port city. There are lots of, enjoyable leisure, sports, or culturally richness. So again, the Busan is obviously very different from Seoul, which is again another very old city, which has lasted as the capital of the whole country for centuries. But Busan is also, I think, does have many other attractiveness as an old and growing new city too. So we will see both parts, again, old history and at the same time those newly dynamic parts of the city.
Right, indeed. I'd have to agree with you as well, Professor Im. Moving forward, so President Yoon is poised to fly to Vietnam from France for a straight visit there. Could you tell us a bit about his agenda in Vietnam?
Sure, that's going to be from the 22nd to the 24th. And it is the first official state visit in the Southeast Asian region since President Yoon took office. It comes on the invitation of Vietnamese President Vo Van Thuong, whose presidency started in March, with whom President Yoon will have a bilateral summit as a main event during his stay. It's actually a kind of return visit following former Vietnamese President Nguyen Xuan Phuk's state visit to South Korea. So the summit will be on Friday, and also separate meetings with top Vietnamese leaders are scheduled, such as with the Vietnamese Prime Minister, National Assembly Chair, and then there's going to be a state banquet on the same day. President Yoon, meanwhile, will travel with the largest ever business delegation for this trip. He'll be accompanied by 205 corporate leaders, including the heads of South Korea's top conglomerates, Samsung Electronics, SK Hyundai Motor, LG, Lotte Groups, and Hanwha Group as well. So according to the presidential office, there are 3 economic key points to concentrate on. First, expanding service and infrastructure exports. Second, supporting solidarity between future generations. And third, strengthening digital leadership. And there are going to be 4 key economy events on that line: a business forum, an exposition on bilateral trade, a luncheon for businesses, talks with future generations on digital future. And some other schedules include a meeting with Korean residents in Vietnam, a visit to a Korean language institution, and he's going to also attend cultural events and local industrial facilities.
Right, good to know. And while we wait for that particular trip, Professor Im, what can you tell us about South Korea's diplomatic ties with Vietnam?
Well, of course, the relationship between South Korea and today's Vietnam used to be very tricky and even controversial, especially because of the war again, the Vietnamese war. But we overcame all this, historically, sad things, and now we really upgraded, elevated the diplomatic relationship. Again, we agreed on the diplomatic ties in the 1992. But later in 2009, we elevated the relationship up to the comprehensive partnership. And as you just, Ms. Kwon explained, when the President Yoon Suk Yeol made a state visit last year, again to this country, again, last year, we elevated once again this relationship up to comprehensive strategic partnership. So we definitely do see all these mutually beneficial, mutually interesting advantages, again, the merits, not only just, of course, economically, strategically too. Because if you think about, for example, South Korea's maritime transportation route, we basically, we are very much dependent on crude oil or natural gas or many other those, natural resources, which is from other regions of the Eurasian continent, especially Persian Gulf. All those transportation goes through the Malacca Strait and the South and East China Sea. So if you think about that, maritime transportation sea route, Vietnam is strategically, of course, important as well. So economically, strategically, and of course, we do share some similar historical tragedy, so we can be, of course, sympathetic to each other more than probably any other country. And interestingly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, many of those Chinese students were not actually able to come into South Korea. So now the Vietnamese became the #1 largest student group in this country. So we do have a big number of, again, the Vietnamese students who study, who learn the Korean language, who are trying to be a professional from the studying experience in this country. So we have, again, multi-dimensional relations these days, which is, again, amazing, which is almost like, I think, a miracle if you think about, 1960s or 70s.
Right. It's very impressive then. So briefly then, it appears like, and do correct me if I'm wrong, that President Yoon is leveraging Korea's business networks to boost the country's economic ties with Vietnam. I mean, he is being accompanied by a very impressive group of Korean conglomerates. Exactly.
No wonder the huge delegation that President Yoon travels with. And Vietnam is a country that's become Korea's 3rd largest trading partner. And this amid a time of global uncertainties, which also means uncertainties in trade. So bilateral trade in 2022, in fact, hit a record high of $87.6 billion between the two countries, and they're also aiming for $150 billion by 2030. So both sides are seeking deeper economic interdependence, and President Yoon at earlier occasions has been mentioning how some 8,000 Korean companies have already entered Vietnam, and it is said to increasingly become a suitable investment destination for high-tech industries like semiconductor and the battery sector. And to gain more leverage in boosting such ties, President Yoon has also been showing support for more development assistance or ODA projects, be it in technology, finance, or human resource development.
Right, I see. Good to know. Well, that is all the time we have for this edition, though. So thank you so much for your time and your thoughts, of course.
My pleasure.
And Professor Im, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, on that note, we end this week's editions of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. Have a good weekend.